Okay, students, so this is the first reading task session. So we would have had a bit of reading for this Thursday, which was around exchange rates. So I'm going to go through what that task was and direct you to make some notes, and then me and Bethan will need to see some evidence that you've made these notes in your workbooks. So this topic is a development topic. It's looking at problems around exchange rates, and more broadly it's looking at the decision of whether a free market or an interventionist approach to exchange rates will help a country to develop. This does link back to the topic of exchange rates and the relative costs and benefits of fixed and floating exchange rates, but this is specifically applying it to a developing country and the problems they have. For some countries, so for example China, they may have the resources to intervene in their currencies themselves, but there is also an overlap of borrowing money from the IMF to help to stabilise an exchange rate. So one of the roles of the IMF is global financial stability. If you go to page 26 in your book, as you can see at the top there, the problems or the development problems that are linked to this are primary dependency, so in terms of low value added, and the poor terms of trade that come from that. And because of that, there can be a deterioration in the balance of payments. It's also linked to a lack of foreign currency in terms of the ability to trade, to take part in trade, and a lack of foreign currency would also affect the ability to import physical capital. So you have a constraint on economic development in the country. So the potential solution, and this is partly free market but also partly interventionist, is that you manage or fix the exchange rate. So the free market approach would be a floating exchange rate. A slightly more interventionist approach, so let's say like a mixed economy approach, would be to manage your exchange rate. So that would be a one-off intervention using IMF money, and if you're going to go completely command economy or significant government intervention, then you would fix it for a period of time. The chart that you can see there is more colourful than the one you have in your notes, but what it is trying to show is that the different levels of risk that the IMF attributes to countries, so specifically debt risk, so countries that may or may not have a significant amount of government debt as a percentage of GDP, and at the bottom here you can see green's good and black is bad in terms of the extent to which debt is significant. So just before the Great Recession, you have a small number of countries that have significant debt risk, and then a large number of countries that have low risk, but a significant number of countries as well that have kind of moderate and high risk. So there was already problems in the system of countries having debt, and immediately after the recession, this is when there were fiscal austerity policies and the IMF trying to encourage countries to reduce their debt. So this kind of shows the average rating of debt getting better, but since about 2013 a significant amount of countries have started taking on more debt, and the amount of low risk countries has reduced. Interestingly, what will be going on in the world at this moment in time is significant increases in government debt. So in terms of countries' abilities to intervene in their exchange rates, going forwards, that's probably going to be quite a difficult thing for those countries to do. Okay, if you, again, still on page 26 here, it talks a little bit about what the IMF's role are. We've already looked at this in a little bit, but it gives you a little bit of information about how much the IMF has in terms of loanable funds. So they can loan up to 300 billion to members, and it gives a figure there of the amount of money they've given to bailouts to countries to help stabilise their economies. Mostly those bailouts have been to cover government debt, so to help with repayments. A small amount of it has been to stabilise currencies, so to stop a currency devaluing too far. It just reminds you what the rules are of the IMF in terms of cooperation, so working with countries to cooperate together, promoting exchange rate stability, because that promotes trade stability, it promotes currency stability, it promotes financial market stability, help to adjust balance of payments, so where there is a significant deficit or surplus, usually deficit, to try and rebalance that, and also to help with some of the economic crisis that might come from a lack of confidence. So we're seeing that currently globally, but just on an individual basis in normal times, it's about trying to provide confidence in markets. It is the same as the World Bank, so you do have the Washington Consensus policies. So even if you use the loans to stabilize your exchange rate, you would have to be involved in some kind of market liberalization, trade liberalization, and austerity, so that you are given these loans on the conditions that you will reduce your debt in future. So while it is an interventionist approach in the short term to intervene in your currency, in the longer term you will have to move towards the free market. So that's just a little bit of a background in terms of where the money might come from to stabilise your currency for an average developing country. However, for certain developing countries, specifically China, they could use their own resources. Okay, so this is page 27, and on page 27 it's looking at the top at the use of the IMF loans for intervention in the market. Question 1 says, is it more likely an LADC will face problems arising from a weakening of its exchange rate or a strengthening? What do you think? It's more likely that it would be around a weakening of its exchange rate. So we think weak pound imports dear, exports cheap. In itself that sounds quite positive, but we'll come back to that in terms of why that might not be a good thing for a less economically developed country. So if we look at the graph as an exchange rate graph, so there'll be exchange rate on that axis, quantity on that axis, and our equilibrium is going to be E and a Q. Now if we have a weakening, so let's just say for example that people get rid of this currency internationally, there would be an increase in the supply of this currency, bringing down the exchange rate to E2Q2. Now the reason why that weak currency would be significant for a less economically developed country is that the goods that they are selling are primary. Most of those primary goods have inelastic demand, so the quantity isn't going to change by very much, and what you're essentially doing is just selling about the same for a lower price. So actually, a bit like a J-curve, your export revenues would be lower. So even though your exports are cheaper, you're just making something that's already cheap even cheaper, and the imports of goods that you need, so those secondary or higher value imports, which again you may have inelastic demand for, especially if it's things like fuels, then the import revenue would go up. So the demand would stay the same for both things, but you'd be getting less money into your country and more money leaving. So that in itself applies the terms of trade and highlights why the balance of payments would deteriorate for that country. The additional negative for a developing country of that weaker exchange rate would also be the cost of capital. So the cost of physical capital would be more expensive, which would reduce the economic growth, or the long-term economic growth within that country. Question 2 says, using an exchange rate graph, explain how the IMF funds would be used to restabilize the currency. So just think for a second, what do you think would happen to that graph to restabilize it? So one way we could show this is the government takes the money and it intervenes directly into the markets to buy back up its own currency, and that in itself would create a stabilizing effect on the market. So E would become E3, and you've got that strengthening of the exchange rate, which would raise the value of the exports, reduce the value of the imports, increase standard of living, and also create greater access to capital goods. So that would be question 3 in terms of the benefits. So greater value exports and a reduction in the value of imports. So just to highlight that there's question 1, over here's question 2, down here's question 3. The last part, which is question 4, in terms of why might the conditions from the IMF loan be detrimental, is around potentially the free market and the privatization causing a monopoly. And then price would rise for consumers, that would reduce standards of living, and reduce the impact of that measure on other markets. The last little piece in this part of your booklet is around the fixing of the exchange rate. So the graph there is just showing a restabilization. However, if it was a fixed exchange rate, you'd probably be fixing that below the current exchange rate. So that would potentially be China increasing its supply of its own currency to maintain a value at a low level, so that if it looked like the currency was going to appreciate, they would intervene to kind of stabilize it. And what you have on that graph is a period of about 10 years between 95 and 2005 where there was full stability of the Chinese currency to the dollar, so that there was no appreciation in the currency during that period. Chinese exporters had a stable exchange rate that they could use to predict and to compete internationally on. Okay, analyse how a free floating exchange rate could allow an LADC to increase economic growth. The arguments for this part, and this is just within that page at the bottom, is a free market approach would allow the price mechanism to automatically restabilize currencies. So if you did have a weak exchange rate, then this would encourage exports. So it's kind of the opposite point of view, and that the quantity of exports would rise significantly, because this would increase your international competitiveness. It would also discourage consumers from buying imports as they were more expensive, again reducing the quantity, and this would lead to the value of exports being greater than the value of imports, and that leading to an increase in short-term economic growth. The question around the stability of a fixed exchange rate, that is partly about stabilising incomes. So if the incomes of a country are stable, this gives businesses and banks confidence in lending and investment. So investment and loans increase, and that in itself will lead to capital accumulation and an increase in long-term economic growth, and you could analyse that using the Harrod-Domar model. The other questions were, how would either of these lead to development? So if you have short-term economic growth, you could link that through increases to gross national income, per capita purchasing power parity. Consumers could spend that money on health and education. If you went down the route of long-term economic growth, you could talk about investment, business expansion, increases in corporation tax, and again that leading to a fiscal dividend for the government, and that in itself could again lead back to health and education. Why might development not result from one of the above? In terms of interventions in currency, you could end up in the situation where there is a currency war or protectionism. So one of the arguments Donald Trump gave for his trade war with China was the manipulation of the currency. And that would then end up with increases to tariffs, quotas, etc., and a reduction in global trade. There could just be also retaliation through the exchange rate, so that other countries do that, or there's also a significant opportunity cost of that income. So if you're using that income to stabilise your exchange rate or to fix it, you aren't using that within your economy to more widely improve public services. Okay, so from these notes, what you need to do is fill in the relevant parts of your booklet, put in those notes into your booklet. That one applies to the last one, so just put the notes in, take a picture of that and email it to me or Bethan.